Okay, I'm going to have a few lectures now about species distribution models because I have very specific material I want to give to you that is not well encompassed by any book chapter or journal article. There's two important messages that I want you to come away from my lectures on species distribution modeling. One is that a species distribution model is an equation. Just like when you do a regression analysis, you get an equation. A species distribution model, though, is an equation that can be turned into a map. The next important thing that I want you to take away from these lectures is that a species distribution model does not tell you the probability of the species being present. Don't ever write that in your thesis, published articles, or say it in a presentation. A species distribution model does not ever tell you the probability that the species is present at any location. Species distribution models are also called ecological niche modeling. You'll hear that term a lot. If climate variables are used, species distribution models are called climate envelope modeling. You may also hear it referred to as habitat modeling or environmental niche modeling. All of the terms have their pros and cons in terms of the metaphors that they conjure that are not completely accurate, but I prefer the term species distribution model. The way that you make a species distribution model is that you take the locations of where the species occurs. You also take environmental data about what the habitat is like at the places where your species occurs. And then you make an equation based on what the habitat is like at the places where the species occurs. You make an equation relating how many of the species are found in different kinds of habitats. You make an equation relating how good different habitats are for the suitability of a species. And then there's a fourth step, which we'll talk about a little while later. The first thing that you do when you make a species distribution model is you go and you collect GPS data about where your species occurs. This GPS data can come from online sources, from people that have already recorded this information. It have to be from sources that you trust, or this can be information that you've actually gathered yourself by visiting these locations and taking GPS readings of where your species occurs. The reason that species distribution modeling is needed is that we can't sample everywhere. So I'm showing you here the GPS coordinates for a plant species called Arabidopsis thaliana in Europe. The species occurs at more places than these points, but it's not possible to visit all of the places in the world where a particular plant occurs and get GPS coordinates for all of those points. What you have to do instead is take the limited information that you have and use it to try to make a forecast to other areas that you are just never going to be able to visit about other places where the species is likely to occur. Then, if you find other places where the species is likely to occur, you can target those places for follow-up visits to try to find more individuals of a particular species. So species distribution modeling starts with locations where you know that the species occurs because you've seen it there and you've taken GPS coordinates of those locations. And that location data is going to be limited. It's not going to tell you all the places where the species occurs because nobody can be everywhere. But it's going to give you some idea of where the species is found. The next thing that you need is environmental data. Environmental data is widely available online. And what you do is you download this environmental data. If you're going to be doing species distribution modeling, this should actually be another bumper sticker. Do not ever collect your own environmental data. Never collect your own environmental data for species distribution modeling. And if somebody wants you to do that as a part of a project that you're working on, you need to correct them that that is not going to work. Environmental data that you use for species distribution modeling has to be complete. I'm showing you here environmental data from the World Climate Consortium, showing what the weather is like at a given grain size across the entire world. In this case, I've got it narrowed down to just Western Europe, but this data actually will tell you the average annual temperature, the average precipitation, the seasonality of the weather, and other climatic things for any place on the globe in a something like 100-mile by 100-mile square. Think about how complete that data set is. Now, these data sets that are available online, sometimes they're not the entire world. Sometimes you'll only have this environmental data for all of the United States. A lot of that is available through the U.S. Geological Survey. You can read up on how the practitioners make these data sets that are so encompassing, that can tell you about the environment at any place on the Earth or at any place within the United States. They do it through monitoring its strategic locations, and then they extrapolate to other areas beyond those locations to make a smooth surface, estimating what the environment is like across the entire world, or at least across the entire United States. Extrapolating is usually a bad thing. You shouldn't do it, but it's something that is done with care to make these environmental layers. Anyway, the point is that if you go and collect your own environmental data, you're not going to be able to collect environmental data for all of Europe or for all of the United States every 100 by 100 meters. So you need to let somebody else do that and have that data, because again, for an ecological, for species distribution modeling, your environmental data has to be complete. There can't be any gaps. So the take-home message here is never collect your own environmental data for species distribution modeling. Okay, so you have this complete information about the environment. At least for some environmental variables, and you've maybe gotten this data from the U.S. Geological Survey or from a World Climate Consortium. The next thing that you do is you put both of these pieces of information into some computer software. And the environmental variables are used to make predictions about what the habitat is like at the places where the species is found. So if the species is found according to the locations that you gave to the software, most often in soils with a particular pH, and it's found less often according to the points that you gave the software in places where the soil has a higher or a lower pH, then the species distribution modeling software is going to make an equation relating that environmental variable to how suitable the habitat is for the species. The basic idea is the places where you have found the species, what the environment is like at those places. Those are the best places where the species most likes to live. So, for instance, here's an equation generated by species distribution modeling software. On the x-axis here, you see soil pH, the acidity of the soil. On the y-axis here, you see habitat suitability for a species. And what you see here, this line is actually an equation. I could show you the y equals mx plus b plus bx plus whatever. But the bottom line is that the equation says that as soil pH increases, habitat suitability increases, but only until you reach about a pH of 5 or 6, and then the habitat suitability drops off. and becomes lower and lower as pH increases. So when you're doing species distribution modeling, you won't just have one environmental variable. You'll have these equations generated relating to habitat suitability of your species for all of your different environmental variables. And then these equations are used to predict other suitable areas for the species across an area of interest. So you can then take these equations and apply them to your environmental layers, because remember that we have environmental layers that you've put into the software that have complete information for what the environment is like for your entire spatial extent, in this case Western Europe. And so the software can use those equations together for each environmental variable and put them together and find the most suitable habitat according to those equations across the entire landscape. And this can give you ideas of other places to visit where you'd be most likely to encounter the species. Typically, these predictions are done in the form of a color-coded map, where the warmer colors indicate the most suitable habitat for a particular species, and the bluer colors represent the least suitable habitat, and green and orange and yellow represent intermediate suitabilities. So you can see that the most suitable habitat for this species is in southern England, northern Germany and Holland, and a little piece of the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Again, a species distribution model is an equation. It's an equation for each environmental variable, relating that environmental variable to how suitable the habitat is for a species. And you put all of those equations together into one mega equation. And this equation can be turned into a map, because you can take this equation and you can then apply it to your environmental layers to forecast other areas that have equally suitable or similar habitat to the places where you already found the species. Beware though, because extrapolation when you're doing species distribution modeling is not okay. So species distribution modeling, you have GPS coordinates for where a species is found. You have limited information, but you've got what you've got. Then you have environmental layers. Let's say this is precipitation, this is temperature, and this is soil acidity. And the software will make an equation relating the places where the species was found to what the environment was like at those places, and use that to predict how suitable habitat is for the species as a function of what the environment is like at different places. Then it can take those environmental layers and apply those equations, or I should say that one integrated equation, to make overall predictions of habitat suitability across the entire landscape. So ecological niche modeling is an equation that can be turned into a map that predicts other areas of suitable habitat for the species beyond just those that you sampled at. But you cannot extrapolate. So for instance, if you do ecological niche modeling on a species that lives in California, and your environmental layers are based on California, you cannot then take your equation that you get from a species distribution modeling and apply it to Texas, because that lies outside of the extent of your points and your environmental layers. Similarly, you cannot take an ecological niche model that you made for California and apply it across the entire globe, because that's outside the range of the spatial extent of California is smaller than the spatial extent of the entire world. The entire world's spatial extent is outside of the range of the spatial extent of California. So those are both different kinds of extrapolating that you cannot do. So you can do this. You can take your points and make predictions for California. You cannot take your points and make predictions for Texas. You cannot take your points and make predictions for the whole world if your spatial extent of your environmental layers and your points is for just California. Now, what do I mean when I say habitat suitability? When I say that the habitat is suitable for a species? Do I mean other places where the species would live happily and thrive if it could get there? Or do I mean other places where the species is likely to be found? These two are not the same thing. And what I mean is the first one. Habitat suitability that you get from species distribution modeling is for the entire landscape, you'll get these habitat suitability measurements which tell you other places where the species would live happily and thrive if it could get there, and it would show you other places where the species could not live happily and thrive even if it could get there, and everything in between. The point is that never say that species distribution modeling shows you the places, shows you the probability of where the species would be found somewhere. It does not. And this is because species distribution modeling is based on the fundamental niche. Species distribution modeling sort of shows you the fundamental niche of a species, although not quite. It more so shows you the fundamental niche than it shows you the realized niche, and I'll describe both. The fundamental niche of a species is the range of environments within which a species can maintain a population that reproduces frequently enough that the population does not shrink. So think about it. If I took you know, some ants and I put them in an environment where there was very little food, the population size of the ants would shrink. The ants wouldn't do very well. Eventually they'd die and there'd be no more ants left. That would mean that that environment with that low food is outside of the fundamental niche of the ants. The ants cannot live happily and reproduce and survive in that environment where there's not enough food. On the other hand, an environment where there's a lot of food, that's within the fundamental niche of an ant. And, the ants in that environment can thrive, reproduce, grow in population size, or at least stay the same in population size. So that's the fundamental niche. The fundamental niche is the range of environments within which the species can persist, that it can eke out a living, that it can survive. In other words, the fundamental niche is the range of environments where a species could be found. The fundamental niche is not the range of environments where the species is found, because there are other factors that could keep a species from being found in some environments. So for instance, maybe a particular species of ant could be found in cooler temperatures, but in those cooler temperatures, there's a frog that eats those ants. So even though the environment is hospitable to the ants at those colder temperatures, within those colder temperatures you find this frog that eats the ants, so they aren't actually found in that environment. So the fundamental niche tells you the environments within which a species could be found. It doesn't necessarily tell you that they will be found there. Another example, maybe an island has really great habitat for a particular species of deer. But if the island is so isolated from any landmass, the deer still aren't going to be found in that environment, even though they would really thrive when they got there, because there's no way for them to get to that island. So species distribution modeling shows you the fundamental niche, which shows you the range of environments where the species could be found, not where it necessarily is found. The fundamental niche does not consider interactions between species or the ability of species to disperse to different patches of habitat. It only considers what sets of environmental factors a species can tolerate. So that's why the fundamental niche doesn't show you where the species will be found. It doesn't consider frogs that might be eating the ants in colder temperatures. The fundamental niche doesn't consider the island habitats that are too far away. The fundamental niche only looks at the habitat and says, yeah, this looks like great habitat. The ants would love it here. A fundamental niche is not the same thing as a realized niche. If you're talking with somebody in science and they're talking about a niche, you need to find out if they're talking about a realized niche or a fundamental niche. So make a note of that. The realized niche is the range of environments where the species is actually found. And again, this could be a narrower range of environments. So maybe a particular ant species isn't found in all of the environments where it could theoretically tolerate living. because there's this frog that lives in these colder temperatures that eats the ant and keeps it from being able to persist in those colder temperatures. So the realized niche is a subset of the fundamental niche. The realized niche is a subset of the environments, of all possible environments where the species could be found. And it's just that narrower range of environments where the species is actually found. This is a graphical representation of what I was just telling you. On the x-axis here is temperature. So we could go from 0 degrees to 40 degrees Celsius. And the y-axis here is precipitation, where we go from a desert environment up to a very wet environment. So you can imagine that there's some range of conditions within which, let's say, a particular frog species is actually found. But then you can imagine that there would be a larger range of both temperature and precipitation conditions within which the frog could actually live if it wasn't for competition with other species or predation by other species in those other environments, and if it wasn't for the fact that some of those environments are in places that the frog can't get to, something like that. So the realized niche is a subset of the fundamental niche. Anyway, back to the fundamental niche. So if we're talking about a frog species, sorry to switch examples here from ants to frogs, but my slides are for frogs. So imagine that this range of temperature and precipitation conditions are all the conditions within which this frog can survive. And outside of those conditions, the frog is dead. So how are you going to find this out? How are you going to find out this range of temperature and precipitation conditions within which the frog can survive? Well, one thing you could do is you could grow the frog or the particular species across a range of different temperatures, ranging from very cold to inhospitably hot. And you could record the temperatures at which the frog doesn't die. So that would show you the realized niche for the frog. You could do the same thing with precipitation. You could keep the frog in very wet conditions and very dry conditions, and you could, this particular species, different members of the species, and you could record the conditions under which the frog doesn't die versus when it does. So this range of precipitation conditions here is the range of precipitation conditions that are its fundamental niche. And then you can put those two things together. So you have a range of temperatures within which the frog can survive. And then you have a range of precipitation within which the frog can survive. So you can grow the frogs more accurately. You can grow the frogs under different combinations of temperature and moisture and find the exact combinations of temperature and moisture within which the frogs can survive and those within which they die. So therefore, it's not just one species anymore. Then you can start to generate that circular pattern of the combination of moisture and temperature within which the frog can theoretically live without dying. But what if you have more than two environments? And certainly anytime you do species distribution modeling, you're going to have more than two environments. So imagine how complicated that graph would be. Rather than just, I don't know, I guess this is about 64 different environments within which you'd have to grow the frogs. If you added another environmental variable, that would be like another axis of the graph coming out of the screen at you, making it 3D. You would then have many more than 64 environments you'd have to try growing the frogs in. You'd have to try growing them in different combinations of temperature, moisture, and acidity, and it would get multiplicatively more and more environments that you'd have to raise these frogs in. It just you wouldn't have the money or the resources available to grow the frogs under all those conditions. So you can't actually measure all of the different environments that are important to a frog. So you can't actually measure the full fundamental niche of this frog. The problem gets worse. What if you want to know the fundamental niche of a humpback whale? What if you want to know the fundamental niche of these sequoia trees? These are organisms that are too large and have far too large generation times to grow them in the laboratory and see under what range of conditions they live versus under what range of conditions they die. It would also be unethical because both humpback whales and sequoias are threatened species. Similarly with panda bears. Or what if you want to do the fundamental niche for an extinct animal like the saber-toothed cat? You can't grow saber-toothed cats under different conditions and see which ones they live in and which ones they die in because they're dead. So I mean, it's a problem. I mean, you know, what are you going to do to figure out the fundamental niche? Kill a bunch of pandas? Of course not. So species distribution models give you a tool to find the fundamental niche of a species without having to grow that species under a bunch of different environments and find all the environments in which they don't die. So by using species distribution modeling, you can find the places where the species is, record the GPS coordinates of those places. You can see what the environment is like at those places because you can use this environmental data that covers the entire United States or the entire world, and you can find out what the environment is like at those places where they live. And you can make a series of equations relating the environment at the places where they live to how suitable the habitat is, and with the general assumption that the places where you found most of the species, those are the places that they like the most, and the places where you didn't find the species as much, they didn't like as much. So it's a way that you can find the fundamental niche approximately. It's not exactly the fundamental niche without having to grow you know, members of a species in the lab and under a bunch of conditions and see when they don't die. So you can do species distribution modeling. I'm recording outside of a coffee shop, so there's going to be more ambient noise than usual. Now we're going to talk about how the species distribution modeling actually works in practice. I'm going to try to make this more tangible. The two main types of species distribution models are regression models and machine learning models. In regression models, only simple relationships between environmental variables and the presence or absence of the species are allowed. With machine learning models, you can have complex relationships or simple relationships between environmental variables and the presence absence of the species. The distinction being that with machine learning, the computer software has more flexibility in terms of the relationships that it assumes between environmental variables and the presence absence of the species. So I'm going to start off by talking about the simpler case of regression models that only allow simple relationships between the environmental variables and the presence absence of the species. All right, let me set up this graph for you here where we have average annual temperature on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have that the species is either present or not present at that level of average annual temperature. So imagine that we go out and we go to a location on the landscape, and we know what the average annual temperature is at that location because we have that data available from a World Climate Database. And then we look around to see whether our species of frog is present there or not. Okay, so now we have that data point that the frog is present, and we know what the average annual temperature is at that location. So now we come to our graph, and we want to take that actual data point and we want to put it on our graph. So take a look at your screen here for a second and think about that. You may have recognized that it's not apparent how we would put this data point on our graph. You're used to thinking about graphs in terms of the x-axis being a continuous variable and the y-axis being a continuous variable. But species presence, which is a yes or no, that's not a continuous variable. So it's not clear where we would put our data point on this graph. logistic regression is different from normal linear regression that you'd be more used to seeing in, on a graph, because with logistic regression, the dependent variable is not continuous, it's categorical. Species is either present or not present. So we have to trick, and that's why I just for to help you remember, have this devious Mr. Burns here. We have to trick the equation into treating the dependent variable as continuous. It's not a trick in the sense that we're doing anything wrong. It's a trick in the sense of we have to use different math that allows for a categorical variable to be treated as continuous. So it's not actually doing anything wrong or sneaky. That's not the sense in which I mean the word trick. All right. Usually when you're doing logistic regression, the dependent variable has two categories. For instance, either the species is present or is not. And so the way that you can use a regression framework where your y-axis is not going to be continuous is you treat the two options, present or not present, as 0 and 1. Because we know how to plot 0 and 1 on a graph. And so that allows us a way to put them on the graph. And so, and then we use math where the math thinks, being a little anthropomorphic here, where the math treats our data points as if we have data that goes from 0 to 1, and where the data can have any value in between. And so then in that sense, then you can imagine that we were just unlucky enough to only sample from this continuous distribution only zeros and ones. As far as the math is concerned, that's what has happened. And so what you do then is you take your data point. So I have my data point of where the average annual temperature was 10 degrees Celsius and the species was present. So I find 10 degrees Celsius on my x-axis, and then for species is present, I give it a 1, so it goes up here at 1. Then let's say at also 8 degrees Celsius the species is present, so that gets another 1. I hope my pointer is showing up on your screen. And then let's say we have a third point where the species is present. That also gets a value of 1. So we have a bunch of values of 1. Then let's say down here at average annual temperature of 2 degrees Celsius, the species is not present. So that gets a value of 0. And let's say at 1 degree Celsius, the species is not present. That also gets a value of 0. So we've got some zeros down here. We've got some 1s up here. And we tell the software, look, give me an equation relating species presence or absence as a function of average annual temperature. Here's your data points up here and down here. Make a continuous equation that relates the presence or absence of the species to average annual temperature. So it'll fit a function like this, where you have on your y-axis here the species is present or absent, but it's treated as continuous so that you can have intermediate values of the species being present or absent, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, a species is either present or not. But from the math perspective, you can have data in between. So at an average annual temperature of 7 degrees Celsius, you can have the species being 50% present, which doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. That's like saying, you know, you're 50% pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. The species is either present or not. But from the math point of view, it works. And notice that the formula that the algorithm uses is one that has a really steep curve in between absences and presences. So this intermediate range of present or absent is a very narrow range of temperatures. So most of the time, the equation does a good job of telling you present, number near 1, absent, number near 0. And it does that according to the data that you feed into it. So that's the way that you can use a categorical dependent variable and treat it as continuous by doing logistic regression. And you can use logistic regression then to make predictions about how average annual temperature influences whether the species is present or absent from a location. And here's some examples of what those predictions look like from species distribution modeling software. And this is actually from the species distribution modeling software Maxent. Maxent can uses machine learning, which can result in more complicated relationships between a particular environmental variable and species presence or absence. But in this case, the Maxent software only modeled simple logistic regression relationships. So you can see here, it's blocked by my video picture, but you can see here that as altitude increases for whatever species this is, the presence of the species, you find the species present. As altitude decreases, you tend to not find the species present. Now, I don't want you to interpret these graphs as the probability of the species presence. You saw that there had a typo there on one of my older graphs. But I want you instead to interpret these graphs as habitat suitability. So you see in the Maxent output it says logistic output, but I want you to interpret that y-axis as being habitat suitability. So even though your input to make these equations was absences or presences, 0 or 1, I want you to interpret these graphs not as the probability of presence of the species, because species distribution modeling will not tell you the probability of the presence of the species. I want you to interpret these graphs as showing you on the y-axis as habitat suitability, how suitable the habitat is. So the output that you get out from this equation is showing you how suitable the habitat is. These suitabilities go from 0 to 1, with 0 being the least suitable habitat and 1 being the most suitable habitat. And these intermediate values you should interpret as intermediate habitat suitabilities. So you can see here the most suitable habitat for this species is the colder temperatures. Most suitable habitat is higher altitudes. And this is based upon logistic regression. So you use this simple logistic regression to predict the habitat suitability of the landscape based on where you found the species, where you did not find the species, and what the environment was like at those locations where you found the species and you did not find the species. As I already described, machine learning models allow for more complex relationships between the presence or absence of the species and the environmental variables of interest. So this is, again, this is just I'm going to do a contrast on these two slides. What I'm showing you now is logistic regression, which is simpler. Now I'm going to show you machine learning on the next slide, which is more complicated. So look at these nice simple curves. Now I'm going to contrast that with machine learning on the next slide. So machine learning allows for much more complex relationships. So now the habitat suitabilities, which is how you should interpret these, the y-axis here, as a function of the temperature, are much more complicated. And the reason you see two different sets of habitat suitabilities for temperature is this is for two different species. But you can see here that the relationship between habitat suitability and temperature is much more complicated. How does that work? Well, machine learning just involves those equations that I showed you, and that quote-unquote tricking of the software to take categorical data and treat it as continuous. It's doing all that same stuff that I told you about with logistic regression, but it's allowing for more complicated equations relating the presence or absence of the species to the environmental variable. And it's doing that using data mining. Data mining means that the software is looking for patterns even that you may not expect. And the approach is that you take any data that you can find, you throw it into a computer, and you let the computer find whatever complex associations between that data that it wants. And machine learning gives you models that work, but they won't necessarily make sense biologically. So I imagine you'd be hard-pressed, even though this model does a good job of predicting species presence or absence and its continuous form, habitat suitability across the landscape, even though this model does a good job of predicting habitat suitability, I imagine you'd be hard-pressed to tell me why habitat suitability is varying as a function of temperature in this way for whatever species this is. Machine learning is, while you might just cast it aside as something that's not useful because you can't explain why it's working, I want to let you know that machine learning is used all over the place. You absolutely will use machine learning in your careers. You'll use it whenever you do species distribution modeling in the software Maxent. Absolutely is something that you will use. It's something that has made Walmart the behemoth company that it is, and so profitable and so successful. Walmart uses machine learning all the time. They collect all sorts of data, and they use it to make practical decisions about what they're going to put in their stores and where. So for instance, Walmart has discovered, and this is true, that customers who purchase Barbie dolls have a 60% chance of purchasing one of 3 different types of candy bars, and I didn't list the types of candy bars there. Walmart uses this information to place those candy bars near the Barbie dolls. Maybe they don't in this particular instance, but there's many other instances where they do that. So you'll often find a strange collection of things right when you enter the front of a Walmart store. And it's often machine learning that has told Walmart to put those things together in the front of the store because they know that people who buy one thing tend to buy the other things. And they know that they maximize their profit when they put those things in the front of the store. So the next time you see cough drops and pistachio nuts next to each other at the front of the store, it's because Walmart has found that this increases sales. So it actually increases their bottom line. So machine learning works, even though the mechanics of how it works are often very intractable, very difficult to understand. Pop-Tart sales are significantly associated with significant weather events. So if there's ever going to be a prediction for a snow event coming through Tyler, don't be surprised if you see Pop-Tarts being sold at the front of the store. Machine learning is also something that you use in your everyday life, that your family use in their everyday lives. Spam filtering in your email, where you train it, where you tell it, this is spam, this is not spam, and where also the software just starts off with some knowledge base. That's all based upon machine learning. Either machine learning where you're helping train the software by telling it what's spam and what's not, or maybe it's something like Google who's already trained the software, but that's all being done with machine learning because computer software doesn't know about 10 simple tricks to weight loss. Here's how. A computer program doesn't know what weight loss is or anything like that, but it knows that based upon characteristics in the email that they're likely spam, and it puts them into your email spam folder. All right, now we're starting to get into the thick of it here. Machine learning is a form of artificial intelligence. So I have a picture of Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, who's an android there to just drive the point home. But let me explain what that means in this context. It means that the software is iterative. Machine learning will try an equation, see how well it works at actually explaining the data, and then if it's not a good match, it'll tweak parts of the equation to make it a better match to the data. So machine learning models learn and adapt. I have a B-movie scary picture here, but it's actually nothing scary. It just makes the metaphor more colorful. And when you do species distribution modeling with the software Maxent, it's using a maximum entropy modeling, which is a form of machine learning, where it tries different relationships among the environmental variables and the presences of your species, and sees how well it did to predict the presence of your species, and then it tries again and it tweaks the relationship among the environmental variables and the habitat suitability until it does a better job of predicting the presence of your species. The software stops running when it's done as good a job as it can at making a habitat suitability model that does the best job of predicting the data that you supplied to it. The equation that ends up being made by machine learning is very complicated. You may remember that when I showed you for logistic regression, there was an equation there that looked complicated, but I'm sure you agree that this example here of a machine learning equation looks much more complicated. It means it's much harder biologically to make sense of what's going on. And it results in those herky-jerky graphs like the one that I showed you in the previous lecture illustrating machine learning. So Walmart uses machine learning, species distribution modeling uses machine learning, many other applications across many other disciplines use machine learning. Don't trick yourself into thinking that the computer software knows anything about Walmart's supply chain management or anything about biology, anything about what a species is or anything. The machine only knows how to use equations and to make equations that fit data that you give it the best. So machine learning is artificial intelligence, but in another way, it's also dumb in that it doesn't know anything about biology in our case. So never forget about that. There's different forms of machine learning that are used for species distribution modeling. There's maximum entropy models, which is what we focus on in this course. There's boosted regression trees, and there's random forest. So just be aware that there's other kinds out there. But they all do the same kind of thing. The premier software for maximum entropy modeling, machine learning-based species distribution modeling is Maxent, which you can download for free from the website provided here, or by Googling it. I already told you about habitat suitabilities in the previous lecture. It's the way that you take the presences and absences, although it's not quite absences, I'll have more to say about that, and the software turns that into a continuous function relating your presences and absences to the environmental variable, and it does this by creating a new equation that gives you information about habitat suitability, how good the habitat is for the species at different locations based upon the environmental characteristics of those locations. You can view species distribution modeling results in the form of a map where, again, this forecast of the equation is made to all places on the landscape where you have environmental data. And this map, that's a forecast of suitable habitat across the landscape, has the same extent and grain size as the environmental layers that you supplied to the software. Now here's the thing I alluded to moments ago. When using Maxent, you do not need actual absence points. Typically, when you use Maxent, you only supply at locations where your species occurs. You don't supply at locations where your species does not occur. Maxent generates its own absence points. And actually, these absence points are called pseudo-absences. You'll also hear pseudo-absences called background points. But these fulfill the role of absences. If you go back at my earlier lectures about logistic regression, these pseudo-absences or background points fulfill the role of the zeros that you'd be putting into that equation to train it. And the way this works is Maxent looks at places where you didn't tell it that the species was present. And it will randomly take 10,000 places where you didn't tell it the species was present, and it will assume that, that the species is absent from those locations. So you might think that that's pretty reckless for, and it's not. But you might assume that it's pretty reckless for computer software to say that, well, you didn't tell me that the species was present here, so I'm going to assume that it's not present here, that it's absent. But if you think about it, that's really not so crazy. let me just go back. I'll just tell you in words. So imagine that we were doing species distribution modeling of the location of pandas. And I was using this huge, enormous forested area in China. And let's say that I told the software specifically where some pandas live. And then the software went to 10,000 other randomly selected 100-meter by 100-meter pixels and declared those to be absences because I didn't tell the computer that there are pandas there, so they must be absent. I would be willing to bet you money that at those 10,000 places, very few of them, if any, are you actually going to find any pandas. Think about this with an example closer to home. Imagine freshwater mussels that live in our rivers and streams in East Texas. Imagine that I were to randomly select a geographic coordinate from somewhere in East Texas. Could be anywhere. Could be, if it's a random geographic coordinate, it could be in the middle of somebody's house. It could be middle of somebody's farm field. It could be in their backyard. I'm willing to bet you money that you will not find, if you're looking for a rare species, I'd be willing to bet you that one of those pseudo-absence points that you're not going to find that rare species at that location. Because think about how unlikely it is that random location is going to fall within a stream. And it's going to fall within a stream that happens to have the right characteristics for that particular mussel. So pseudo-absences actually do a good job of approximating where a species does not occur. And it's easier than having to gather a bunch of absence points. In the end, from Maxent, you get a forecast. And it's not a forecast like in the future we expect blah, blah, blah. This is a forecast in the sense of taking your limited data points and then using it based on the environmental layers that you supply to the software. It's able to look at the relationship between the data points that you gave it and the environment and forecast other areas that have similar environments where also the species is likely to be more suitably inclined, the places that have more suitable habitat for the species. Again, I don't ever say that species distribution modeling tells you the probability of finding a species. It does not. But it gives you a map like this where the redder areas are the more suitable habitat and the bluer areas are the less suitable habitat. Here's the Alps. So the species does not have suitable habitat in the Alps. We've already gone over what the kind of thing you give to species distribution modeling software. You give it a spreadsheet with the latitudes and longitudes of where you found the species. You give it environmental information that has to be complete for your entire spatial extent, where every single pixel across the entire landscape, it tells what the environment is like at that location. So this is data that you do not want to collect yourself because you can't visit every location in East Texas at a resolution of 100 meters by 100 meters. You have to use this environmental data that's provided from the U.S. Geological Survey or from some climatic database that is absolutely complete. If you go back and look at my earlier lectures, the equation that you see here is more complicated than the one that you saw for logistic regression when I had the same slide for logistic regression. So look at how much more Greek letters there are. This is just to emphasize the fact that machine learning can develop much more complicated relationships between the presence or absence of your species and your environmental layers when it makes that new equation that we call habitat suitability that you then project onto the landscape based upon the environmental factors of the landscape at every given location. So Maxent gives you a pretty map which shows you areas where the habitat is more or less suitable for the species, where the grain and extent of the map is exactly the same as the environmental layers. But it also gives you some summary statistics that are called model fit. Two of these are the area under the receiver operating characteristic receiving curve, which we just call AUC, and gain. And let me tell you about both of these. Well, I already told you about the pretty map. Now, when we say model fit, we don't mean fit in the terms of, oh, this model is strong. We mean it in terms of how well the equation is able to predict the data that you gave to it. It means how much you can trust Maxent to reliably predict habitat suitability for a species across the landscape. And if you get really bad model fit with your model, you shouldn't use it. So let's talk about AUC. AUC, and we'll talk about this more in class, is the probability on average that a presence point that you gave to the software at the end, when the software is done, has a higher habitat suitability assigned to that location than a randomly chosen pseudo-absence point. So AUC values range from 0 to 1, where 0 is bad and 1 is excellent, and 0.75 is usually considered good enough that you have a useful model. Gain. Gain is a statistic that maximizes the probability of presences in relation to the background data, where taking the exponent of the gain gives the mean probability of present samples compared to pseudo-absences. And we'll do an example of this in class. But gain is another way to assess model fit that you will use quite often if you're doing species distribution modeling. But another very important issue with species distribution modeling that I want to discuss is this issue of test data versus training data. So you have all of your data that you give to Maxent. But what Maxent will do, if you set it right, is it will set aside some of your presence points that you give it, and it will not use them when it's building this equation relating the environmental variables to the presence or absence of the species to make habitat suitability equation. So this set-aside data, these presence locations that Maxent doesn't use, it will then use to test itself in the end to see how well it did. So it'll make this equation, it'll make this map of habitat suitability, and then it'll take this test data that it set aside, plug it into the map that it made, and see how high the habitat suitability was forecast at that location where this now newly discovered test data actually occurs. And what you would hope is that if Maxent did a good job, that location should have a high habitat suitability score, and that the habitat suitability score at that location should be better than most of the other habitat suitability scores on the landscape as represented by the locations of these pseudo-absences. Anyway, so when you're using species distribution modeling software and you see something like the test AUC or the test gain, that means that these metrics, AUC and gain, were calculated based upon the test data. So the model was made based upon all of the other data points except for the test data, but the metrics AUC and gain, if you see test AUC and test gain, those metrics were made based upon the test data alone. So imagine if we ran Maxent and we gave it a bunch of locations where our species occurs, and we set aside a test data point. And then the test data point ended up occurring at that location indicated by the arrow on your screen. Would you expect the test AUC to be high or low? In other words, would you expect that most of the other habitat suitabilities on the landscape are higher than the habitat suitability of our test location, or lower? This is something we can work on in class. Contrast that with here. Imagine that our test data point ended up being in this location. Would you expect the test AUC to be high or low? So think about that. Now let's talk about training data. Training data is all the other presence points that weren't set aside by the software to test itself at the end. So training data
is what Maxent uses to build the equation of habitat suitability. And remember I told you that machine learning, which Maxent is iterative. So it will try different relationships among your data points and the environmental variables, and then it'll see how well it did at predicting with high habitat suitability scores that the species should like to live in the locations where it was found. And then if it didn't do a good job, the software will try again by tweaking the relationship between the environmental variables and habitat suitability until it gets something that works pretty well. But notice that Maxent is using the same data over and over again iteratively to do a better job. It's using that same set of data that you provided to it. And it'll calculate an AUC based upon the training data, and it'll calculate gain based upon the training data, but this is not considered to be as reliable because the software is just maximally fitting an equation to the points provided to it, which may not be generalizable outside the range of those points that you provided to it. That's why the test data is so much more valuable than the training data. I want to emphasize again that species distribution modeling is based upon the fundamental niche, so that species distribution modeling doesn't tell you the probability of finding the species occurring at a given location. It only tells you habitat suitabilities at a given location. Remember the bumper sticker. But also consider that a lot of your funding, if you're going to have a career in wildlife conservation and wildlife management, the different partners that you'll be working with aren't going to care about fundamental niche. They want to know if it's okay for them to build a bridge here over this river, or if they can't because the species is there or not. So often these partners that you'll be working with will want to know whether the species is present or absent. And yes, you can do this with species distribution modeling, but only when you're done doing your species distribution modeling, you can then take the results and you can use those results to try to make some claims about whether the species is present or absent at specific locations across the landscape that you didn't sample. That should only be done with caution, and I don't want you to think that that's naturally what you get out of species distribution modeling. That's something that you can infer based upon some assumptions from species distribution modeling, but it's not a natural outcome of the species distribution modeling. And the way you do this is with thresholding. You take a habitat suitability score above which you decide that I'm going to declare that any habitat suitability score above 0.6 on the landscape, I'm going to declare that the species is present there. Does it mean that the species is actually really present there? No, but that's your assumption that you're making. So take it with a grain of salt. There's entire research papers devoted to this enterprise of trying to declare across the landscape that any habitat suitability score above a certain amount, species must be there. But I'm just going to go over some of the more common thresholds. There's a prevalence threshold, there's an average probability suitability threshold, and there's an equal test sensitivity and specificity threshold. The different people disagree about which threshold you should use. It's a very thorny area. And I'm actually not going to talk about what you see on these slides. You have these slides available. You can pause my lecture, or you can download these slides. You can read about these different thresholds. You can also read about the literature that I cited to find out more. But there are different thresholds you can use based upon different criteria. And then what you do is you simply declare by making yourself emperor that any pixels on the landscape, places that you didn't sample that have habitat suitability scores above that threshold, you're going to tell TxDOT you can't build your bridge there because the mussel species is there. Whether or not you've actually visited to confirm it, that's your best reasoning about whether the species is present or absent there. For more information on Maxent for doing species distribution modeling, this paper by Elif et al. In 2011 is a very good resource. It's very technical, So you should treat it like an encyclopedia. It has more in-depth information than you would need, but everything is there, and you can read in smaller amounts different places of it to get the gist of it. So that's the end of my lectures on species distribution modeling.